So, cylinders. This is where it starts getting really technical. So this is why I tend to do the shape last with people, because you've got to fight the wheel a little bit to push things up and tall when it wants to squish things out. And there's various little techniques and stuff that you need to get to grips with how you hold and change. It's different from bowls. So I'll just recap the centering again, and then I'll take you through just literally a straight cylinder shape, and show you all the stuff that's different from what you've done before. Alright, get it stuck down. So I usually teach people to centre by pushing from the side, the top, and then pushing from the side. When you get a little bit more used to it, you can actually start off pushing from the corner. And that'll help you just tuck that edge in right there. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. Plenty of speed, plenty of water. And 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you try throwing something, you'll find you kind of run out of up. You can get to about here and then it just won't go any further up for you. So the first thing that you do when you do a cylinder is you pull it out wider than you want, and then every time you throw you gather up a bit more clay, narrow the bottom, and that's what gives you the height from it. So you'll find doing a cylinder quite difficult if you give it a chunky bottom the first time round. So when you're starting on cylinders, leave it just about a centimetre, sort of finger's thickness. So it's not making life too difficult for yourself. So give yourself about a centimetre there. Always make sure when you're pulling out that you are pushing down on the top with the clay to make it spread out properly. So if I wanted to end up with something that eventually had that kind of width in the base, you want to take it out about 50% again. So about half the size again. There we go. Then the usual thing, getting to compact the base. Now remember, if you're going to start narrowing it and gathering it up, the clay in the corner here you're going to start using, so you want to make sure when you're doing the compacting that you are getting right into the corner and making sure that bit is also well behaved. So you find if you use 2 fingers for that, it's easiest to get it tucked right in there. So do all the usual work there, and then we're ready to get started. So throwing the cylinder does feel rather different from throwing a bowl. I always get people to start throwing by having a hand down, this one downwards and this one sideways, and partly that's to make it slightly easier when you learn tool shapes, so to get your hand down into what you're doing. When you throw a bowl, your fingers kind of look like this, so you squish a bit of clay and you start throwing like that, and that kind of naturally gives you a bit of a curve on the inside there. With cylinder shapes, you generally want to avoid that kind of curve. You don't want a really chunky corner in here when the rest of the clay is thin. So you actually want to try and keep this a right angle as much as you possibly can. So rather than throwing like that and using your fingers to do the thing on the outside, you want to actually start by almost digging your fingernails in on the inside. It will feel like you're doing much more than you actually are. So it'll feel really thin and like you're digging your fingernails really hard, but then if you cut through later you'll realise it's actually a lot thicker than you think it is. So to start with, you almost want to be digging your fingers in there to keep that right angle shape. And then rather than just bring your finger and then going up, you bring your finger and you let them both go in a bit because you're pushing that clay narrower, and then you carry on going up. So whilst you're right down at the bottom, you've got your fingernails kind of tucked in. Once you start rising a little bit, you can flatten your fingers a touch because it's a bit easier to throw like that. But to start with, you're really, really pushing that to try and make sure you've got the shape. And when you throw a bowl, you can start by just throwing up because you know everything's going to get spread out. When you do cylinder shapes, you want to overcompensate even more. You want to pretend that you're throwing a cone. So you really push a lot harder on the outside, but throw to an imaginary point. So the very first thing you want to do is just make sure the clay is pointing in the right direction. So when you get a bit more used to it, you can do that as part of your first throw. To start with, you might just want to do that as another movement. Hand resting there, sponge resting there, and literally just tilt it over. Push it so that it's pointing towards the middle. There we go. So now you can start your throwing. So I've got my hands quite up, my fingers tucked right in. You generally find you want a little bit more strength and support than one finger will give you. So squishing another one behind it or next to it is good. That'll make sure you've got the stiffness there, but with only one little part of your finger touching. So I'm going to start pushing that right towards the centre, really pushing hard to be a point. And it's super important with cylinders that you keep the top part really clean and really compacted, because there's a lot of cylinder type shapes, you know, vases, jugs, bottles and things, where you want to be able to work on the top. And if that clay's gotten weak before you get to that point, then there's nothing you can do with it. So I'm going to keep my fingers nicely tucked in here. I'm going to pull up a little bit more again. This time I'm going to push and narrow the base a little bit and keep on going up, pushing right towards the centre. And whilst you're not so used to how to gather up the clay here, you might find yourself getting like gooey bits and things. Just get rid of that, just scrape it off. You don't need it incorporated into your pot. The trick for gathering it up is to sort of not just push with your finger, but kind of tilt it under slightly. So I've got my fingernails tucked on the inside there. I'm kind of tilting this as I push the first one to make sure it pushes through all right. And then I'm coming all the way up. Now the tricky thing with cylinders, as opposed to bowls, is that you suddenly go from very thick clay down here that you're trying to shove as hard as you can to something that feels much, much thinner by comparison, where you hit that right angle. So it's really easy to overdo it, to carry on shoving it too hard and just end up shearing the whole thing off because it's too thin where you've been pushing. So you've got to get used to that drop-off point. So get your fingers in there ready to throw, fingernails tucked in nicely. Tuck this finger under, push that clay to narrow it. And then this next bit, you just want to take your time to figure out, put the pressure on quite nice and firm, but really take your time to figure out where that drop-off point is. And once you're past the danger zone, then you can just carry on going up. Now, if you have a little look at my hands here, I've got my right hand down and it's nice and anchored on the top, but I'm starting to stretch now. It's like, how am I going to get up further? So when you're throwing the cylinders, regardless of whether your hand is down or not, always keep your elbow tucked in. And that way, when you start getting a little bit too high, you can lift your body up and your arm is still nice and supported. One of the other challenges with throwing cylinders is that as you get the height, you no longer have the luxury of joining your hands anymore. So you've got to get used to them being wobbled a little bit separately. So having that elbow tucked in is really good. Having this hand go right down should hold you in a nice locked position. Just a little bit. And sponge on a stick. More useful for getting in and cleaning up the bottom every now and again.
Sponge on a stick. Yeah.
So after a little bit, you may well find that you're struggling to get your hand in. That's actually no big deal. So long as you keep your clay fresh and in really good condition, you'd be able to stuff your hand in to get it wider, to get right down to the bottom, and then puddle it back in again at the top. So as long as the clay is in good condition, you should be able to do that as often as you need. So I'm going to get a bit more water here, get down and do it again. So now I've really got to get my hand down. It's going to widen out a little bit. Get in and do this next one. Now, for the most part, you're trying to keep that nice right angle on the inside. I'm just going carefully over that point. Throw the rest of the clay up a little higher. You really want to avoid making the top too thin too early. So it's worth actually almost consciously leaving a little bit thicker clay on top. Don't let it go thin, otherwise it'll get weak too quickly and you'll find there's not much shaping you can do. So always try and have a little bit extra in here. You can carry on finishing on the throw and get it taller and thinner later, but you don't want to get it weak too quickly. Alright, so as soon as you get to the point where the clay is just drifting ever so slightly past vertical, that's when you need to start colouring, because as you do your throwing, and each time you narrow the base, it's eventually going to be popped up more and more upright. If it goes very slightly past, that's when you're in danger of collapsing and losing control of the shape. You're just not going to be able to get it back in again. So proper colouring rather than just doing the top. Make sure it's really nice and wet, because if you do this dry and your fingers stick, you've had it, you'll collapse the whole thing. And then you want to try and find a way of making a nice little collar around the piece, but you don't want to create lots of friction, so you just use the very tips of your fingers. My favourite is 6, With 4 that'll do nicely, but it's quite easy to end up making an oval shape rather than a circle. So I like to use middle finger, thumb and the 2 tips of knuckles here. So you start right at the very base, you give it a little squeeze, but the real thing is pushing upwards. And that will narrow the whole pot up. There we go. So as soon as it starts drifting past vertical, then immediately get in the collar until you're ready to actually start doing something with the shape. So it's always easier to stretch something out than it is to try and bring it back in again. Now as you collar something and you push the shape narrower, the walls get thicker. So eventually you get to the point where the walls don't actually want to collar anymore because they're a bit too thick. So if you like trying to do like a little bottle top, for example, you have to alternate. You have to collar and then throw to get thinner and then collar a little bit more. If it doesn't feel like it wants to go anywhere, it probably wants to be a bit thinner. And if you're collaring and you see some rippling going on the top, that's the warning sign that it's about to collapse and have problems. So if you see rippling, don't try and do any collaring anymore. Alright, so I'm going to get in here and do another throw, do another pull. For this particular shape, I'm just going to literally do a cylinder, just to show you all the details for this. It's a little bit dry in that corner. So I'm kind of liking this proportion now, so all I really want to do is just get in the last of this little bit of clay, bring it up. So now I'm thinking I quite like nice straight walls. I'm not going to let it go vertical yet, but I will take it a little bit straighter. So fingernails tucked in, this finger turning around nicely. And I quite like that as the base for my cylinder. So now I'm going to carry on throwing. And if I have a little more pressure on the outside, the shape will go narrower. If I start putting a little pressure on the inside, the shape will go a little wider. And now I've got to the point where my hand is squishing it out. So I'm just going to bring it back in and then I'll carry on doing the throwing here. Still leaving the top a little bit thicker. Alright, so I'm going to do once more and that should get rid of the last little bit of clay and come up. As a general thing, whenever you're trying to shape a tall shape, don't ever try and do the shape all in one go, just do it bit by bit. So, tucking this in nicely.
At this point, have you got your fingers clawed in at that bottom?
In the bottom, clawed in.
Still
Once they get up to the top, I've let them flatten a little bit so it's a bit easier to throw.
Okay.
So I'm kind of starting like that, digging it right in, and then as I rise, I'll let them come out a little bit so it's a bit easier. And when you're doing bowls, you've got a really nice broad, wide area, so you can rest the whole of your hand and you can find support easily. When you're doing a cylinder, you don't always have the luxury of getting quite so many fingers in, so you have to aim and be a little bit more accurate with it. Just collar this in a touch. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm happy. I am going to allow the top to be a little thinner. Your movement and the shape is always the most fluid when you can do it in one go, but there's no reason you can't stop halfway through your throwing movement to adjust your position or water or collar the top in or whatever, and then carry on. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that now. It just needs the last bit of trimming and shaping and what have you. So let's start with the usual thing of just giving it a really nice dry. Make sure this is a good lick. First thing, I'll just get rid of the gooey stuff around the corner. There's not much here for a cylinder, so you could probably just do it with a credit card, but it's up to you. So now if I want a really crisp cylinder, I'm going to use a nice rigid shape like the credit card, just to finish it off. And the idea is to hold the credit card up and then stroke the clay from the inside up against it so it takes on the shape. Now if you literally just put this vertical and go for it, you'll find it ends up going past vertical, so it's good to do this in 1 or 2 goes and just sort of feel your way, don't try and do it all at once. And also good, rather than having the card vertical, just to tip it ever so slightly inwards, and that should help you stop flaring out by accident. So I'll pop this in the bottom here. And draw this up the side. Now very often with a cylinder type shape, you will find yourself needing to work on the bottom first, and then once that's done, you can work on a narrower shape at the top. So I can just about get my hand on the okay. It's a little on the narrow side. You're going to have to do one part then the other. So just remember, if you're ever leaving a part, not working on it, just keep it dry so that it can't get damaged. Can't get weak whilst you're working on the rest of it. There we go. So nice neat little cylinder. I'll just give the top a little going on here. Now cylinders, when you come to turn them, they're usually a pain in the neck, to be honest with you, because they're rather taller, they're much easier to tip over. So unless you've got a particular reason, it's usually easiest to just leave a small amount of clay and then tidy up the bottom here whilst you're on the wheel. So if you tip this over overhand, pop the corner in there, just scrape everything out, get it all nice and clean. And then if you flip it, so you've got underhand, the idea is to poke the little corner in and then tip it so it pushes up a little roll of clay. You might have to do this a couple of times if it takes out more clay. So poke that little corner in, and then it's sitting nicely, just roll it up like that. And grab your round sponge, wherever it's gone. What have I done with it? Oh, here it is. Sorry, come on. If you dry it and then just push it up against it neatly, that'll just give you a nice little clean shape to your roll. So that'll mean it cuts off much more nicely when you're using the wire, cut off nice and clean. That little tiny lip also is about the kind of thickness of the glaze, so it means that when the glaze goes down, it's very unlikely you'll ever get a little stray drip going underneath, because it's just a little catching it nicely for you. These will want to collapse when you take them off. So.
Oh God. So what do you do?
That's why these are really useful. So it's big enough actually. Just so pop it on the top, and then run a finger around until you've got a completely unbroken wet circle all the way around. And when that's there, the air is sealed inside and it won't let it collapse.
Wow.
There we go.
That's actually fun.
It's a really useful little tip. So cutting whilst you're moving is always going to get you a cleaner cut. Yeah. Scarier with it because these tool shapes, they want to move. So
yeah.
Then we could just take them off. Not quite so easy to move these without putting fingerprints on them. So I tend to use one hand down here, one hand and keep my thumbs up here, so that if it does tip, I'm still able to catch it with a thumb or something at the top.
Yeah.
There you go. Thumbprint. And then as soon as you've moved it, take this off so it doesn't stick onto it. That'll do the job nicely for you. Now having done that, I'm going to slice this one up so you can see on the inside. See if I can stop slithering around too much. Come on. There we go. Right. There we are. So that's what you're looking at. So as much as possible, you want to have a nice even thickness all the way up here. You will have a little extra thickness down there. Just the nature of throwing means that you do need a little bit of extra support right at the base. But you can see you've got a nice kind of right angle thing going in here from really crooking your fingers in. So I'll start by crooking my fingers in like that when I'm throwing. So I'm practically digging my nails in, and then I will let the pad of my finger come up. So it's a little bit easier to support it afterwards. So that's the kind of shape that you've got going on in there. You will find that the way it feels and the way it looks is not necessarily what you expect. Your fingertips are so sensitive, especially when you're digging your nails and you're like, I'm going to go all the way through. It's always thicker than you think at the bottom. So if you're ever doing one of these and it's going a bit Pete Tong, you don't want to keep it, or you're just practicing, cut it in half, take a look, see what's going on there. There are also useful things you can do for pots that have gone a bit wrong. Like this, for example, you know, when you do pulling handles, you pull the clay all in the same direction so that you can shape it nicely without it warping. That's effectively what's happened to the clay here. So you can do yourself a bunch of handles just by taking those strips off. It's also quite nice to take the opportunity to practice doing pulling for spouts. So any kind of bowl or cylinder or whatever you're about to throw away, you can do those all around the room just to get a bit of practice and then get rid of them. Even little test tiles, just so you've got freestanding ones to do stand-up things. So most of the time when you're doing cylinders, you will just want to practice to start with, but you can still get useful bits out of them. Right, let's get rid of this one. Okay, so classically, that's how people start to teach you the tall shapes. There's a lot of techniques in there that you need to get the hang of. So the theory is great. You start wider, you throw towards a point, and as soon as it starts going past vertical, you start doing your collaring so you can bring it in more. And you've just got to get used to things being different from bowls, feeling different, how you tuck your fingers in, how you hold your body. It just takes rather more practice. And it's not something you can do unless you've already started getting a feel for the clay. But most of the time, of course, you're not doing a perfect cylinder. You're doing the various shapes that come from it. So a teacup or a jug or a bottle or something along those lines. So I'll put that to one side, give this a clean, and I'll show you a little bit about shaping. The only problem with sitting thinking through cylinders is that actually shaping a cylinder does take quite a while to get used to, and it's a bit of a pity not to take the opportunity to practice that at the same time, because otherwise you just like get the cylinders and that's great, and then you've got a whole extra set of learning to do. So I'll drag out another piece of clay, and I'll show you what you need to know about the shaping a cylinder. I've got my hands all over the clay here, completely wrapping around, and that means it moulds very nicely because it's got the shape controlled the whole time, but I'm still only ever pushing with that part of my hand. My left hand isn't doing anything other than just staying still. Right, okay, so that's there. I'm going to start by slim bottom, about a centimetre, then pull out wider than I actually want it. Get in and do the usual work. Make sure you are getting right into that corner to finish off the compacting and centering there. You will find that doing a cylinder shape is really tough if your clay is not perfect, like really difficult. So first time I usually send to some clay for people so you can just concentrate on the techniques and stuff like that. Last time I tilted it, this time I'll show you literally just as your first throw. You can just be pushing it right into the middle. That's usually what I'll do. And now we can start throwing proper. So yeah, usually the first time I'll center some clay for someone, then I'll give them something that I've wedged, and then you can do your own wedge stuff. Because by that point you do start to notice there's a really big difference when those things do or don't line up properly. So you will probably find that you're quickly going to have issues with things getting wobbly and uncooperative. So mostly the thing is just to take your time with it. If it's feeling wobbly, just let your hands do their thing, don't try and rush it. As soon as you get a vertical wobble, maybe your fingers have dipped into that space down here a little bit too much or something like that. As soon as you get a vertical wobble, then of course every time your fingers go into it, they try and make it bigger. So really useful little tip for that kind of situation is to get everything nice and wet, including your fingers. And you want to put one finger on the inside, one finger on the outside. Start by resting, just crunched up, nice and still. Use my third finger, this one actually. Start by resting and gradually increase the pressure. Squeeze the edges of your fingers together and then gradually take it off. So that will flatten the wobble shape, but it's also enough compaction that it will start to make the clay stronger. So if you see any twists, if you see any other wobbles or bulges or anything like that, that'll make your life a lot easier to keep it in good condition. So, especially if you see a twist start to develop, that's going to want to collapse like concertina style. So if every time you throw you give it a little bit of reinforcement, you'll find you can keep control of that and it won't collapse before you've had time to do what you want to with the clay. Alright, so I've got a little bit of height on it. Now we can talk about shaping. So in an ideal world, what you want to do is to have the same thickness all the way through a piece. Let's say I'm aiming to do a vase shape like that. If you start with a cylinder and then you push out the bulgy bits and you narrow in the thin bits, then of course you're going to get different thicknesses through the whole thing. It's going to get very thin where it bulges and much thicker where it narrows in. So there's two ways of shaping on the wheel. The first is to throw the clay, so literally to put it in position whilst you're throwing, and the second is just to stretch it out. So if you stretch it, it will imperceptibly stretch back a little bit. You notice some more with some shapes than others. But if you throw it, there's kind of a limit to how far you throw it because you need support in the clay to be able to do that. So usually you use a combination of both. You throw it into shape as much as possible and then you use the stretching to finish off the last little bit. So around about this point, where I'm still bringing up clay, still throwing up, still narrowing the base, you want to start thinking a little bit about what kind of shape you're after. So if I'm aiming to do a kind of vase shape, I want it a bit more bellied out the top. And I want to keep it really quite narrow at the top, the top section, and I'll leave the clay a little bit thicker here so that I can then flare it out a little bit later, but I'll still keep the top narrow to the end. So do the throwing, tuck those fingernails in, turn this finger a little bit as I'm gathering up the clay. A little bit careful as I go over that danger point, just take my time. Lovely. So I'll let this go up almost like a straight cylinder at the moment, but at the top I will make sure it stays in really narrow. I won't necessarily squeeze all the way to the top, I just want to keep that a little bit thicker so I've got clay in reserve. So I'm going to carry on throwing like that now. I won't bother keeping the clay much narrower than that, but I will narrow the bottom. So keep pushing in there, under there, bring up some more clay. Won't worry too much about this part being wider, but I will start narrowing in much more from here. Now if you want to have a base that's wider than the top, or the same width as the top, that'll give you a shape that typically looks quite sort of quite chunky, quite farmhouse. If you want a shape that's narrower than the bottom, that tends to have the effect of, narrower than top, sorry, it tends to have the effect of making things look a bit more elegant, so it depends what kind of shape you're going for. You will find once the base starts getting narrower than the rest of the pot, it gets very twitchy. It's really easy to knock it off its axis, so it goes round and round. So if once you get to the point where you're trying to get it narrower than the rest of this, you've just got to take your time a little bit more, be a bit more careful about putting pressure on, and a bit more gentle about taking it off. Once you get to the point where you start seeing a slight wobble, that's the point to stop. But there is a really good little cheat for getting bottom narrower later, which I'll show you. So I'm going to stuff my hand in. Perhaps I want to widen up a little bit there. I'm going to keep turning my finger under here to get it a little bit narrower, get some more clay. And now I'm going to start letting it get a little bit of more obvious shape. So a little more pressure from the inside, still moving the clay. Gives me a bit more of a belly. Now I'm getting to the point where this is too narrow for me to do my thing, so I'm going to start working the pot in two sections. So this is a bit wetter. I'm going to collar it in. You don't leave it wide, you always narrow it back in and then widen it back out, if that makes sense. Alright, to here, it's a bit dry on the inside there. So I'm going to open it back out again, tuck my finger right underneath here. Bring it up a wee bit, and I'm going to let it belly nicely. Alright, so I could bring it a bit narrower, but I'll leave it like that so I can show you what I can do with the rest of it. And I'm pretty happy with the bottom now. It's the top that we can be doing some shaping with. So I'll leave the bottom relatively dry. I'm going to get in and collar this top part, and I'm going to hike out the water from inside before it gets too skinny. Alright, so now a bit of water here, a little bit more colouring. And now a little throwing so I can get it a little narrow here. So, just before I move on, I can't get my hand in. I'm going to give it a little work from the kid on the outside here. This is the point where you can change the shape and do a bit more stretching if you need to. Get that dry. So that little hack I told you about getting the bottom narrow if it's starting to wobble a little bit, this tool is really handy for that, because when you're cutting like that and you're pushing, there's quite a lot of force behind it. So when the clay gets a bit too thin, it stops cutting and it starts shoving. So do it the same ways and be quite steady about putting pressure on and taking it off. Start cutting away any thickness of the base from where it's been narrowed, and then it'll start pushing the whole thing narrower. So that's a really useful tool for getting things narrow when you're not quite there with your throwing yet. Want to narrow things down, make sure it's not too thick and chunky down at the bottom there. And then when the base is the way you want it, you can get in and do the last thing with the kidney. So again, same with the rigid one. I'm just going to use the curves on here to clean, get everything nice, get the shape stretched out to the place that I want it. And now that I'm happy with what's going on the bottom, I'm just going to do the work on the top. So, where's the sponge? There it is. A little bit narrow there. Throw it a little bit thinner so I can get it in a little bit more. I've chosen a flare top here, but I could just as easily do a kind of bottle top or something if I wanted to. So it's nice and narrow at the top there. So just a random funky little shape. So now I'm just going to scooch off the moisture from down here and then continue cleaning and shaping the top here. Now there are tools for getting in to the inside of a pot like this. Throwing sticks. You can even use the sponge if you want a little bit of pressure. It does take quite a long time to get used to doing this because you don't have the same sensation as you do with your fingertips. So it takes quite a while to practice. I've always preferred to use my hands and to open things out when I need to, get my hands and then close things back up again. But you have to have good technique for that because obviously you have to still be able to keep the clay really fresh. If you can't do that, you're going to struggle. So some people just find it more convenient and some people find that they can't necessarily throw as easily without one. There we are. Alright, so playing around with the shape, that's all nice and covered. There we go. Now if you've done the cylinder and you've ended up dead flat on top, you've done a really good job at every stage. Chances are you're probably going to end up with something that looks like that quite a lot of the time, which you can either just trim off using a harp or a needle, or it does make for a really nice shape for a spout if it's a little bit higher one side than the other. So yeah, when things are wobbly and tricky, just really take your time. Keep on compressing every now and again to keep the shape under control and keep it nice and strong. I'm going to finish this off the same way, if I can find a bit of credit card. Clean all of this little lot off. Especially when you do the shaping and stuff, you can get the outside really nice and dry and clean. The inside is not usually worth bothering with trying to get in the kidney in the same way you do with the bowl. Just making sure it's as dry as you can make it with a sponge should keep the integrity good for you. There we go. So essentially the shaping comes from varying the pressure, whether you do it pushing from the inside or pushing from the outside. But once you've started getting it perked up, that's when you want to think a little bit about what kind of shape you're going to do. So if you're just going to do a straight up mug shape, or maybe a mug shape that was a bit narrower at the base coming out, maybe something a little bit more curvy. Chances are it won't turn out to the shape you envisaged to start with, but that's okay. It's worth practicing the shaping at the same time as doing the cylinders, because otherwise you just got a whole new level to practice once you've mastered them. It's a little When you start doing more complicated or taller shapes, that's when it can be quite nice to learn how to throw on a bat, because then you don't have to try and move the pot, you can just take the whole bat off and deal with it when it's leather hard. The only problem with using wooden bat is that the grain of the wood, it grips the clay whilst you're centering, so you does grip and try and pull it in one direction, you get a little bit of a twisting happening, and you've got to get used to not grinding it with your hands, so that takes a little bit of practice before you get used to it. In the meantime, you can just move these things the usual way, or if you've got something really nice you don't want to touch, you can wash your hands and use a heat gun. Here we go. That's quite cute.
That is really cute.
Right.
Nice.
So, not sure if I've got enough centre clay that I'd be able to give you a ball. But yeah, so when you're trying to do stuff taller, take the time to really try and get the clay as straight as possible. So work at the centering, but also do the kind of donut thing to get it under control. You want to start wider, push right towards the centre, and as soon as it starts getting a little bit wider, that's where you want to be doing your colouring. Cool. Yeah, when you're learning clay on a wheel, it's not like a really simple journey where you start like not knowing anything and then you gradually get better and better. It's more like a, that's easy, oh my god that's hard, oh that's easy, oh my god that's hard. So centering cylinders, shaping cylinders, they're all ones that's like, oh, okay, this is really great. So it's one of the nice things if you've got longer in a studio than just the odd session, you can just go, okay, I'm just going to destroy stuff for a bit, I don't have to feel pressure to make something really nice. So yeah, just keep tanking through. If you're really serious about learning the clay, it's good to not be precious at all about cylinders. Just line up loads of clay, get through it as quick as possible, and that's the best way to do it. Whether you get it right, whether you destroy it, just keep tanking through. You just need to get the experience of your fingers to get to grips with those. So,
Nice. Okay.
all right, over to you.
Thank you very much.